love, surrender to self-reservation from others who can and sell. Blindness to touch perfection, but hers just like anything else. Isolation, isolation, Mother, I try to believe me. I'm doing the best that I can. I'm ashamed of the things I've been put through. I'm ashamed of the person I am.
Hi, Frabens. Buongiorno, running a little late today. First time in the semester, but had a lot of COVID-19 related things to deal with, like paying the utilities and doing whatever. So this is the first in the actual series of lectures that we're going to do. What I want to do today is I didn't want to give Berger short shrift in chapter 4, because I think chapter 4 pretty much summarizes everything that goes on in the preceding chapters, and I think it's very important that we cover that chapter, because that chapter will definitely be one of your midterm essay options. One of the midterm essay options will be to take a preceding chapter, either chapters 1, 2, or 3, and make comparisons to what Berger says, and one of those chapters to his culminating arguments in chapter 4. Okay, so remember, we look at chapters 1, 2, and 3 as being chapters 1, 3, and 5, however you want to slice it. But that's going to be probably one of your midterm options. And we didn't get through all the slides for that chapter, so I'm going to do that first. And hopefully we'll get into history. I want to do a short history of photography so we can start dealing with Sontag. Okay? But as far as your readings for this week, it should be, and I emailed them out to you, it should be Susan Sontag's In Plato's Cave, Andre Bazin, The Ontology of the Photographic Image, and Peter Benson. Really, you need to read Sontag first, all right? Because we're going to have to spend at least one session covering the things that Sontag has to say about photography. So as far as where your reading should be, if you want to read it, at the very least, you should have Sontag read by now. I sent the... it runs about 15, 17 pages, and I understand that it's very dense, too. It's like she makes reference to a lot of different things and events that you might not be cognizant of, and I would avail myself of Googling stuff. You know, when she makes references to, for instance, a film by Godard, I would be referencing that stuff so you can understand exactly what she's attempting to say in that. And it's very interesting. Coming in today, I was listening to NPR, and we had talked about this last class, about this idea of the Shirley Temple effect, we called it, when in times of crisis, in times of catastrophe, people have a tendency to turn to funny things and lighthearted things and easygoing things, and one could say banal things or saccharine things of a certain type. And this call-in show on NPR was asking people what they were watching, and it was really kind of interesting psychologically to see the types of things that people were binge watching. People were watching lighthearted fare. But people were also watching things like going back and watching The West Wing. I don't know if any of you ever watched that, or Parks and Rec, to look at scenarios where people in government and people in civil service act competently. Perhaps it's some kind of wish fulfillment. The other interesting thing was a caller called in and was talking about going back and looking at old classic Hollywood films as his form of psychological, as his psychological coping mechanism, which was very interesting. And they said some things in relation to that. So, I mean, in terms of what we were talking about, and even tying into what we're going to talk about today, I mean, that's interesting. It's interesting to see how people are kind of turning away from reality or putting a veil up in front of reality in order to deal with the present. As far as, I wanted to tell you guys about a couple of different sites really quick, and one is COVID-19 related. I know I had brought this up on Tuesday, but one of the best, what I'm hearing in terms of critical input, one of the best and most highly organized epidemiological websites about what's really going on with COVID-19 is actually came from Down Under. From Australia. It is called virologydownunder.com. Leave it to the Aussies to put something together that's cool. You know, the creators of the band Split Ends at Midnight Oil and other really cool things. But this is definitely a go-to site for you to check out what's really going on. You know, and in that spirit, I wanted to point out another place that you could go. This actually gets broadcast on public radio, I think Sunday mornings. It's called On the Media. It's a podcast too. You can check it out under WNYC. Just Google On the Media. Google On the Media. And they've been up for a couple of years. And basically what they do is put together stories. They have this huge archive, too. They put together stories about the way, not about current events, not about sports, but the ways in which the media tends to cover or drop the ball or have an agenda in regards to the ways that they cover certain issues. And each week they take something that's, you know, like on the front burner in terms of current events and what's getting covered, and they analyze it in terms of the ways in which the media are handling things. And so that's an interesting go-to site for you as you are hunkered into your respective bunkers and respective man caves and looking for things to do. There's a lot of content here. And I'm sure there's going to be some COVID-19 related stuff. So that's just, you know, my usual attempt at Nick's picks for this week. Haven't been watching a lot of films lately due to trying to get up on all and sundry, but those are a couple of things. So we've got that, so you know what the readings are. Email me if you need to find out more about this. Want to get back to Berger. Want to get back to what he has to say in the last episode. And what he has to say in the last chapter of the book. Because I think he brings it all home to us. And I think that if one poses the question, is his analysis still pertinent for 2020? I think that, you know, you'll have various responses to that. But, you know, the book and the series being written in 1973, it begs the question, is it still pertinent? To this man's mind, to Mr. B's mind, it remains exceedingly pertinent, exceedingly prescient, if not, you know, beyond where we are. All right. He starts the chapter by saying, "We are now so accustomed to being addressed by these images that we scarcely notice their total impact. A person may notice a particular image or piece of information because it corresponds to some particular interest he has, but we accept the total system of publicity images as we accept an element of climate. For example, the fact that these images belong to the moment but speak of the future produces a strange effect, which has become so familiar that we scarcely notice it. Usually it is we who pass the image. Back when he was writing this, we had billboards, there was a lot of signage, on the streets, a lot of static imagery. Usually it is we who pass the image, walking, traveling, turning a page. On the TV screen it is somewhat different. Even then we are theoretically the active. Yet despite this, one has the impression that publicity images are continually passing us, like express trains on their way to some distant terminus. We are static, they are dynamic. Until the newspaper is thrown away, the television program continues, or the poster is posted over. And there's this sense, there's this kind of prescient, prophetic sense of what we will ultimately be swimming around in with our iPhones and with our iPads. And not only that, but think about things like the bank. Think about things like the checkout at the grocery store, the checkout at most of your fast food restaurants now. Most of our waking hours are spent interacting with some type of mobile screen. I mean, it's gotten to a point, like, I go to get my gas, I gotta sit there and watch these kind of insipid promotions for their thing. But there's also this generic kind of what's up in music today? It's there's all these corporate partnerships that take place in this kind of imagery. But this whole idea of being of images being mobile and passing us, and we're kind of stuck in this kind of Peter Sloterdijk, the famous German philosopher, who I've been reading a lot of recently, talks about the media sphere, how we're all and it's more than just being in a bubble. There's the whole idea of the bubble, but there's also this idea of just kind of being in an actual kind of tangible sphere, of images, and we all kind of walk around in our own sphere, and those spheres keep us somewhat in the matrix, so to speak. We all have our own spheres, and it seems like exceedingly pertinent due to this period of isolation that we would speak about these kind of spheres or cocoons that we kind of exist in, that are there, and that we kind of interact with, and that we ultimately have a hand in generating. He goes on in page 149 to talk about publicity. When he uses publicity, it's basically just, one can say that it's kind of a British term for mass media advertising. So when he talks about publicity, think about advertising. All right, think about advertising, think about public relations, think about all of that. He says publicity adds up to a kind of philosophical system. It explains everything. Hold on a minute. Got to make sure that I got everything on. It explains everything in its own terms. It interprets the world. All right, what does he mean? Think about it. Think about commercials. Think about advertisements. Think about the ways in which pop-up ads are designed, the content of pop-up ads, the content of listicles, the content of programs themselves. Even narrative programs tend to have these codes of what constitutes the good life, what constitutes normal behavior, what constitutes the right behavior, for instance, for teenagers or the elderly. That there are a lot of implied ways and implied ways of behaving and implied coercion, and the world and the world in total that publicity gives to us, and that we have a tendency to accept, and we have a tendency to to normalize them, to turn them into our own set of beliefs. We have a tendency to adopt and internalize all of these different beliefs, and it constitutes our psychic being, our psychological landscape in a lot of ways. And we walk around with that. And we walk around not just with all of the nice things and all of the candy-colored things, but we also internalize all of the fear things that publicity generates in us. And Berger talks about the ways in which it creates a sense of what I like to call less than thinking in people. Here's a current picture of Times Square that is just kind of illustrative of what I'm trying to say with this. You know, it's like Times Square, I mean, essentially it's like Times Square would be like the epicenter of this kind of media overload. But Times Square, I would contend that Times Square is everywhere now. You know, through the use of iPads, it's like we live in this huge version of Times Square. Everywhere we go, we are walking in the equivalent of this. Berger goes on. Publicity is not merely an assembly of competing messages. It is a language in itself, which is always being used to make the same general proposal. Within publicity, choices are offered between this cream and that cream, that car and this car, but publicity as a system only makes a single proposal. It proposes to each of us that if we transform ourselves or our lives by buying something, let me reread that. It proposes to each of us that we transform ourselves or our lives by buying something more. This more, it proposes, will make us in some way richer, even though we will be poorer by having spent our money. All right, so I think we all kind of get this at this point. This idealized life is through consumer goods that is usually based on this idea of magical thinking. That, you know, if we use this particular brand of antiperspirant, we're going to be a lot more socially acceptable or a lot more sexually attractive, or we're going to have more friends. You know, always there's this kind of cognitive disconnect between the product itself and what it portends or what it pretends to promise. You know, so there's the reality and there's the promise. You know, and this is what he's saying here. Publicity, he says, is never a celebration of pleasure in itself. Publicity is always about the future buyer. It offers him or her an image of him or herself made glamorous by the product or opportunity it is trying to sell. The image then makes him envious of himself as he might be. Yet what makes this self, which he might be, enviable? And this is interesting. It's a very, very interesting paradox. Let's reread it. The image then makes him or her envious of himself as he might be. This idea that publicity creates an envy within us of ourselves in some future manifestation, somewhere down the future, some future self that I might be through the use of this product. The envy, yet what makes this self which he might be enviable? The envy of others. Publicity, he says, is about social relations, and he's not the first person to point that out, and he's certainly not going to be the last that we're going to read. Guy Debord makes a lot about this idea of the spectacle, what he calls the spectacle being far, far less the actual things that we see and far more about the relationships that we have between ourselves, our social relationships, how publicity and images and news and gaming have a tendency to construct specific kinds of social relationships, all right? Publicity is about social relations, not the objects. Its promise is not of pleasure, but of happiness. Happiness is judged from the outside by others. The happiness of being envied, he calls glamour. And we all know this term, and we all know the ways in which this kind of ineffable concept of glamour evolves, how it's evolved over the years. Just watch shows like Entertainment Tonight or the other shows that come on after the news on TV 12. These shows are all about envy, all about celebrities and all about the lives that they live, and we kind of vicariously live through them while at the same time kind of hating them. There seems to be that kind of paradox that goes on. We love them, we commiserate with their joys and their sorrows, and we read their exposés in People magazine about how they overcame this substance abuse issue, or how they're dealing with parenting with this busy jet-setting lifestyle, and yet at the same time we somewhat hate them, either unconsciously or consciously. The happiness of being envied is glamour. And he goes on. The spectator buyer. And this is a very important concept that we've talked about a little bit in the past, but we need to understand this hyphenated term of the spectator buyer, all right, the potential buyer, and how you yourself as an individual are addressed and figured into this equation. Not as a human being as such with your attendant thoughts and feelings and aspirations, but as a kind of point of ingress, a kind of point of being able to coerce you into generating more profits for whatever the respective advertisement is for. The spectator buyer is meant to envy him or herself as she will become if she buys the product. She is meant to imagine herself transformed by the product into an object of envy for others, an envy which will then justify her loving herself. This is a very, very interesting concept, all right? This idea of happiness being equated not with one's own personal sense of well-being or self, but a happiness that is equated with being envied by other people. A happiness that is equated with being envied and being the envy of other people. This is the way the system tends to operate. One can put this another way. Berger says, the publicity image steals her love of herself as she is and offers it back to her for the price of the product. Let's repeat it. The publicity image steals her love of herself as she is and offers it back to her for the price of the product. Basically, the whole thing is very complex, and yet the whole thing is simple. Basically, the message is one of getting taken and being coerced into the idea that you're not enough, give me your money, and you will be enough for yourself. See how that works? Berger also makes a lot about the idea of how the motifs of classical painting and classical art are repurposed by advertising to create a kind of aura or ambiance of gentility or being civilized or elegant or this kind of this sense of old world well-to-do-ness, distinction, and it uses, and we talked a lot about how the advertising industry will like play upon works of classical art, and in in a sense, spoof them and delegitimate them in a certain way. Ultimately, kind of spoofing and making fun of things that weren't necessarily intended to be made fun of. And we see it here again in a Nike ad. Just do it. Going back to what he says about the oil painting. The oil painting showed what its owner was already, he makes it, there's a shift that goes on historically, and it's a shift of class. And it seems to rise up around the time, and it rises up far earlier than just like the rise of middle class suburbia. It seems to be tied with the rise of the mercantile class, the Renaissance. You know, I mean, in terms of like where we could put it historically, it's complicated. But there comes a point. The oil painting shows what its owners were already enjoying among his possessions and his way of life. That's what the oil painting did. It consolidated his own sense of his own value. All right? That was the purpose of that particular medium that only he could really afford. Right? It enhanced his view of himself as he already was. It began with the facts of his life. The painting embellished the interior in which he actually lived, which is a very interesting idea. So the oil painting basically served the role of the upper classes and the ruling classes as a kind of mirror. It's like, yeah, that's me. I'm the shit, you know. It's like, as opposed to this kind of paradigmatic shift in the idea that publicity does something different. Publicity is no longer speaking to the ruling class. They've already got them. They've got everything they need. Publicity does something entirely different. The purpose of publicity is to make the spectator marginally dissatisfied with with his present way of life, not with the way of life of society, but with his own within it. It suggests that if he buys what it is offering, his life will become better. It offers him an improved alternative to what he is. So we need to understand this distinction between what the oil painting did and what publicity does. Publicity plays to your sense of being inadequate. Publicity uses different devices to kind of coerce you into coerce you into a way of thinking that makes you start thinking, well, it's like if I go, and sometimes it's like, for instance, there's nothing ostensibly wrong with the idea of one going and, for instance, as a New Year's resolution to decide, like, oh, I'm going to start working out. I'm going to go get a treadmill or go to the gym. Go get my, that usually like goes down the hill around like, I'm going to do this every day, and it's like by about January or 17th or 18th, the resolution starts to wear out a little bit. We start missing days. But anyway, there's nothing unreasonable about the idea of going and buying an exercise cycle to look good, feel better about yourself. No one's saying that a lot of this stuff doesn't do some of the things that we buy it for. No one's saying that it's a total shill. It's like last January I came home from Christmas vacation. I'd seen myself in photos. I was like, holy, it's like I just immediately went and started doing 3 miles on the treadmill, and I felt better, and try to keep those kind of resolutions. So no one's saying that the thing doesn't often provide the things that we want from it. It's all the other stuff. It's all the world. It's all the sense of self. It's all the other, it's like things that it promises that are usually just kind of fantastic and somewhat bewildering. The oil painting was addressed to those who made money out of the market. Publicity is addressed to those who constitute the market, to the spectator buyer, who is also the consumer producer, for whom profits are made twice over, as worker and then as buyer. The only places relatively free of publicity are the quarters of the very rich. Their money is theirs to keep. Their money is theirs to keep. I'm always struck by, for instance, going to the grocery store and seeing like employees of the grocery store off duty, and they're like pushing their shopping cart and buying stuff from their workplace, sometimes at a discount. Those discounts have gotten less and less over the years. I can tell you from my personal relations with people that work in these kind of places. But like, I work here and then I give my money back to the place. This whole idea. Publicity is addressed to those who constitute the market. What is the market? The market is us. The market is us. To the spectator buyer, who is also the consumer producer. The consumer producer. Don't forget, it is us in manufacturing. It is us in retail. It is us working in a data call center that is not only manufacturing the product, but later on buying the product. We are essentially manufacturing the stuff that we will later go and buy. All right? I love that picture of the guy putting the pizza. I'm sure his boss told him, you've got to put the pepperoni on counterclockwise, or else, and you got to make sure that the cheese is nice and even, or else you're out of here. And he's even thinking to himself here, counterclockwise. And just another image to reiterate, just to drive it home a little more. Nothing wrong with working for a pizza shop. All publicity works upon anxiety. One could say that publicity, in a sense, I don't think I'm going too far off the limb to say that in a lot of ways publicity generates anxiety. It generates the anxiety of not being good enough, or missing out on something, or being left behind, or by something. It generates these kind of feelings that get assuaged, that get taken away by going and buying the thing. The sum of everything is money. To get money is to overcome anxiety. And we saw in the episode how Berger showed ads for, you don't have to go broke, and certainly, it's very, very pertinent for where we're standing this week in terms of the ways in which the mass layoffs that are going on, the way that people's wages are being cut. I heard a very interesting story this morning about Amazon workers. Jeff Bezos, the grand paragon of the world, is going to be magnanimous enough to give his laid-off workers 2 weeks paid time off. A rather generous sum from one of the masters of the universe, who is worth, his personal worth is more than most of the developing nations, if not some of the developed nations, to give his employees 2 weeks of paid time off, after which they will get unpaid time off. Unpaid time off, okay? So where's the money going to come? Where's the money going to come, my friends? We don't know yet. Our august president has offered up the idea of sending us some checks to offset, and knowing this, knowing him as well and as intimately as I've gotten to know his game over the last 3 and a fraction years, there will be one check. Okay, there will be one check. That will be handed out as a token gesture that the government really does care and is going to take care of everything that will arise in this situation. But getting back to this, alternatively, the anxiety on which publicity places the fear that having nothing, if you don't have anything, then you will be nothing or you are nothing. So basically, let's cut through it. Let's cut through the matrix. Basically, the overall message is you are what you got. Or as we used to say back in the 80s, he who has the most toys when he dies wins. If you don't have any toys to play with, it's like the kid down the street. There was the kid down the street. When I was growing up in my neighborhood, there was the kid down the street that had all the toys, all right? And he was a bastard about it, too. He would kind of lord over the toys and let you, I'm just tired now, I'm going to just retire. It's like, you can't touch that particular toy. This whole idea of the fact of the matter is that if this kid's parents didn't buy him all the toys that he had, he wouldn't really have any friends at all. He really wouldn't have any friends at all. So there's that. Money is life. Not in the sense that without money you starve, not in the sense that capital gives one class power over the entire lives of another class, but in the sense that money is the token of and the key to every human capacity. The power to spend money is the power to live. According to the legends of publicity, and now he refers to it as legends of publicity, those who lack the power to spend money become literally faceless, and we see it here in this photo, which was also an advertisement. Those who have the power to spend become lovable. He'll go on in the episode and in the chapter to talk about during the early 70s, it had to do with television advertisements and magazines, but he draws attention to the types of lifestyles that are portrayed, for instance, on one page of Harper's Bazaar or The Atlantic or Time Magazine, of this sumptuous, sexy, outgoing, usually takes place on a boat or on a beach somewhere in some Caribbean situation, and there's usually alcohol involved with the somewhat concrete realities of a lot of people's growing and a growing number of people's existence, and he talks about, he says, glamour cannot exist without personal, social envy being a common and widespread emotion. Glamour cannot exist without personal, social envy being a common and widespread emotion. Which is a very, very interesting and somewhat chilling statement. That this system of advertisement, that what commercials do, that what Madison Avenue does, that what public relation mechanisms at respective corporations have a tendency to do is build envy as a thing. being a common and widespread emotion. How we're jealous of each other. How when my next door neighbor, Joe just bought a new John Deere riding mower. Must have cost him a bunch, but if I'm going to keep up, I got to go buy one if not just like that, better. I've got to buy one better than Joe if I'm going to keep up. That the system itself is driven by these emotions of insufficiency, of less than, and keeping up with your neighbor, and certain people in power that have a tendency to capitalize from that. The industrial society, which has moved towards democracy, this is a very interesting statement that he makes here. The industrial society, which has moved towards democracy and then stopped halfway, is the ideal society for generating such an emotion. This is a very interesting concept, and the idea that the society itself, many of the tenets of the society, many of the social and political movements that were springing up around the time that Berger wrote this were emblematic of the idea that we were moving toward a society that was much more democratic, and that he will contend that we stopped at a certain point. We stopped. And there's a lot of rhetoric within the literature and within cultural and economic analysis about the idea that the powers that be, especially like during the 50s and 60s, started using this term, too much democracy. We had too much democracy, and it was going to cause a destabilization of the ruling class, really. That, it's like the danger of people having too much freedom was a threat to them. So that certain mechanisms were put into place to stop that halfway. The pursuit of individual happiness has been acknowledged as a universal right, right? That's what's given to us in right there, right in the beginning. There's this whole idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's been acknowledged as a universal right, yet the existing social conditions make the individual feel powerless. He lives in the contradiction between what he is and what he would like to be. He lives in the contradiction of what he is and what he would like to be. Either he then becomes fully conscious of the contradiction and its causes, and so joins the political struggle for a full democracy, which entails, amongst other things, the overthrow of capitalism, or else he lives continually subject to an envy which, compounded with a sense of powerlessness, dissolves into recurrent daydreams. Let's reread that, okay? Just so that we got it down. Either he then becomes fully conscious of the contradiction. There's a contradiction involved here. There's a contradiction in modern life, all right? He either becomes fully conscious of that contradiction and decides to do something about it. He breaks free from the matrix and says, hey, wait a minute, we're getting screwed. And starts to organize and mobilize in order to fight for things like social and economic and political and gender justice, and so he joins the political struggle for a full democracy, which entails, amongst other things, the overthrow of capitalism, or else he lives continually subject to an envy, which, compounded with a sense of powerlessness, dissolves into recurrent daydreams. It's very, very interesting. I'm reading a book right now by Bernard Stiegler, and some of you, I was sharing some of that in the other class with. The chapter that I'm reading right now starts to talk about this idea of how this tendency to daydream has a flip side. There's like the nightmare side of the daydream, right? But what we find is that the publicity image tends to feed these daydreams that we have are what is often called in psychological and psychiatric circles magical thinking. Magical thinking that really doesn't shore up with reality. And there's numerous examples of that, but let's move on. I just thought this was an interesting image to kind of sum up what Berger is talking about here, this kind of dissociation that goes on, and many great poets and writers, throughout the period of like the war and even before that, talk about this idea of we have become fragmented. There's a great book by Herbert Marcuse called One-Dimensional Man, or Man in Search for Himself. The sense that we're not all we can be, or that something has been robbed from us in one way or another. This lingering sense, it even like falls into the Matrix, Remember Morpheus is talking to Neo and he says, you've had this feeling all your life that something is just a little bit askew. Something's just a little not right, and it kind of bothers. And then even Trinity says to him, it's kind of been like, scratching at the back of your conscience, driving you mad. She gets a little bit over dramatic about it. So that's the end of Berger chapter. That's Berger. And it may ultimately end up being one of the options you might want to write about Berger. There's a lot there. And certainly writing for his time in the early 70s, he was very, very prescient of what was to come. He was definitely one of the warriors for truth and justice. Perhaps not the American way. Want to move on to photography. Berger touches upon photography in chapter 1. He talks about the ways in which photography as a medium, especially once it gets widespread, how it's a game changer, not just as a medium, but Marshall McLuhan, the famous media scholar, said about every historical medium, whether it be the printing press, whether it be radio, whether it be the telegraph, that every time some kind of new form of media technology hits the stage and becomes normalized, it doesn't just change the way we communicate. It doesn't just change the way that we take in information. It doesn't just change the things that we do to entertain ourselves. But he will go as far as saying, and so will Susan Sontag, that it changes everything. It changes our social relations. It changes what we do recreationally. It changes things economically. It changes things politically. We need to talk more about Marshall McLuhan in this class. But so Berger is already talking about the ways in which photography changes our relationship to objects, changes our relationships to time, changes through the mass reproduction of art. It changes the nature of that art, And some of you took that up in your papers, in your 2-page papers. By the way, I will get to the 2-page papers hopefully over the weekend, and it looks like what I'll do, and we had discussed it, and I had discussed it in the introductory lecture, would be that I'll scan them and send them back to you with the corrects on them. And remember, for the 2-page paper, you do not have to do a redraft unless you want to. Haven't really had a chance to look at them yet. Definitely going to get to them over the weekend. So be expecting those in your emails. Each one will be sent to you personally. It's going to be a lot of work for me, but whatever. A lot of you tackled. I'm sure a lot of you tackled option 1. Which was the way, had to do with the ways in which Berger talks about photography, the different ways in which photography would be a game changer for society. and you were supposed to choose 2 options. What is photography? What is it, really, when you think about it? We all just kind of take it for granted nowadays. We're saturated with it. Half of us spend a lot of our waking hours taking pictures of stuff. Where's the word come from etymologically? Taken literally, it comes from the Greek. It combines the Greek words photos and graphos. Together they mean drawing with light, or sketching, or the trace of light. Even today, the term photography is being manipulated to fit digital imaging, all right? But we're going to spend a lot of time between that Sontag, the Bazin, and the Benson article. We're going to start to make this argument and pose the question of whether digital photography really is photography in any real sense as the old form of photography, or whether it's an entirely different medium. All right? That's the question that's going to get posed. The disjunction and the distinction between this medium of chemical photography, which a lot of you are taking courses with Tara or Richard or JR, and taking a picture with your digital camera. How those 2 things match up. All right? Even today, the term photography is being manipulated to fit digital imaging, but in its most elegant form, a photograph may best be described as a reasonably stable image made by the effect of light on a chemical substance. A reasonably stable image made by the effect of light on a chemical substance, all right? Now this somebody just doesn't wake up one morning and have this entire formula in their head. Like, Eureka! I have come up with a formula to make photographs. No. This goes on over a long period of time trying to figure it out. And there's a bunch of different problems involved in it. All right? There's a bunch of different interrelated problems that are involved in creating photographs, and we'll talk about that. All right? Light is energy in the form of the visible spectrum. If light or some other invisible wavelength of energy is not used to make the final picture by chemical means, it cannot, by this definition, be a photograph. Okay? If light or some other invisible wavelength of energy is not used to make the final picture by chemical means, it cannot, by this definition, be a photograph. All right? Well, this will be a problem when it comes to electronic image. It's like, I think this is a very, very stringent definition of what a photograph is, because I think ultimately it's like we need to have, this is kind of a purist definition of what a photograph is essentially. But we also have to pose the question about not only digital imagery, but things like an X-ray. Is an X-ray a photo? How about, a picture taken with an electron microscope? Aren't all these things in one way or another a record of light? We'll have to pose that question. The first primitive attempts at making a photograph had to do with this device called a camera obscura. A camera obscura. Not really a camera as much as it was, and some of you know what this is, some of you don't. A camera obscura, pretty much the historical record says that they started springing up as early as the Renaissance and probably far earlier than that. But they were these devices that Leonardo da Vinci would make use of. A camera obscura. And all it was just a box. And they came in different sizes, right? But to really get the full effect, you had to almost have a room, which would have a pinhole. It's basically a pinhole camera, all right? You can do them with a shoebox. Kids, in some classes, in like STEAM classes, I'm sure they're, the teacher is like, let's make a shoebox camera. It's like, and basically all it is this. It's a box or a container, and one end is a hole, All right? And due to the nature of light, due to the way that light operates, whether you take the wave model of light or the photonic, particle version of light, whichever way you want to slice it, because of light's intrinsic qualities, it goes through the little pinhole and it leaves an inverted reflection of whatever is out there on the other side. And what artists would do would put trace paper over it and sketch it. All right, it would produce an image. All right, that was the first leap, the first technological leap in this. The next problem becomes this. It's like, all right, we get an image. How do we make that image stable? How do we create a circumstance in which I can take that image and make it permanent? That becomes as the guy says in The Wizard of Oz, that becomes a horse of a different color. And it will be a long, drawn-out attempt by a lot of different scientists and would-be scientists and inventors to come up with the chemical substrate that would react with light and fix the image and make it durable, make it something that would last. That was the other part. Early attempts at this in terms of chemicals, some of the early pioneers with this would get an image using different types of chemicals and different types of things like silver halide, and these guys were usually, chemists at the same time, and they were trying to come up with the particular element. They were using different kinds of metal and the ways that metal interacts with light and iodizes. They're using copper, a lot of different combinations of things to try to get a durable image. This is an 18th. It's like so. That's still up the road, but by the 18th century, by the 1700s, we already have some new elements added into this. A guy whose name escapes me actually comes up with the idea of a lens. And some of these ideas, believe it or not, the first lenses, do you guys know where the first lenses were actually created and invented? No, Mr. B, we don't. Well, I will tell you. A lot of work in optics and lens grinding, specifically, making glasses, making reading glasses for people, for nearsighted and farsighted people. A lot of that work got done in Western Europe in monasteries. Monasteries were the birthplace of a lot of what we know as being optics, which is interesting. And this whole idea of leaving a trace, the guy uses a mirror. And here we already have the idea of having to have a mirror in the apparatus to take the inverted image and flip it right side up. And he's tracing away. From all historical knowledge up to this date, this photograph by Joseph Niepce, he was a Frenchman. The French did a lot, if you're of French extraction, you can pat yourself on the back at this point. The French did a lot in terms of the development of photography. This one was done by Joseph Niepce. His French name is Nicaphore. I don't even know how to pronounce it, but he's generally called Joe. He was just a Joe. 1826, the earliest permanent photo, all right? And it's called View from the Window at La Grasse. It was probably taken from outside of his window, all right? One of the things that people don't notice about it, I want to make sure we're still running here. One of the things, I know I'm going to get loud now. I'm going to get loud because I'm near the camera. One of the things that people don't realize about this, if you notice, the entire scene is an outside scene, and yet all the different structures of it are exposed. They're all exposed. Why, you might ask? All right, I'll ask for you. Why does that happen? The exposure times are still very, very long. It takes a long time for light to interact with the image in order to get any kind of image at all. All right, that's another one of the problems that the photographers are going to have to solve. How do we get an image in a quicker amount of time? This image took about 8 hours. So what you have is you would have the sun rising and going over the zenith and coming back down, and you would get a full exposure as if it had been fully exposed. Because it probably took, they say historically it took about 8 hours to produce this image. So you get this like kind of full exposure of the back courtyard. I believe that's a roof. There's a couple of different towers and parapets there. 1826, all right? Niepce would have a partner. Niepce would die very early, actually, but had a partner by the name of Louis Daguerre. And Louis was kind of interested in what Niepce was doing, but he wanted to take it into another direction. He created what would historically be known as the daguerreotype, taken from his name. You know, he wasn't modest. Which was basically an interaction of metal. Usually they would use some kind of like metal, like aluminum, but different chemicals like silver halide or bitumen would be put on the image, and then a negative would be stripped away. I think it was either a negative or it might have been a positive image, but he comes up with this idea of the daguerreotype. And that would be a huge leap in the idea of the photographic image. They're still laying around. If you go to like antique stores or antique shops, maybe some of your grandparents or great grandparents still have some. They're very, very beautiful. They have a very, very ghostly kind of ethereal look to them. And 99 times out of 10, they're like still black and white, although some of them would later be colorized like after the fact. So this is a daguerreotype of Daguerre, a daguerreotype of Daguerre that he took of himself. So there's this idea of the daguerreotype. 10 years later, we can see how the resolution of the image is getting better and better. This is a beautiful, beautiful picture called the Boulevard du Temple in Paris, all right? If you notice, and if you do any reading on it, I mean, just in terms of its composition and its sense of black and white tangibility and its perspective and in the way it kind of trails off in the light, it's very beautiful. If you notice, one thing that people forget is that Paris was very, very busy at this time. During the time that this was taken, okay, that street would have been teeming with people coming back and forth and carriages and all kinds of stuff. Why don't we see any people, you might ask? I'll tell you why. The only people we see, it's like, because the image takes, the exposure time for the image is so long. It was probably a couple, 3 hours. The process probably got better at this point. But the exposure time is so long that you don't catch any of the people moving around. All right? There were probably people all around here. It's just that the image doesn't catch them because they come and go. They come and go. And it's only getting the stuff that is staying still. The only people it gets is right here. And purportedly a guy getting his shoes shined. Probably took a lot. It's like, I don't know. Maybe the shoe, maybe Bonjourno just like screwed up major here by dropping my audio device. Now it's going all. Hello, do you still hear me? Are you there? It's like, okay, there will be many gaffes like this. All right. It's like, please, I'm not going to edit them out. This is just me, like warts and all. All right. So anyway, this idea of speeding up exposure times is going to be key. All right. And one of the big players in that game is going to be a little company that is just a couple hours away from us. It started in Rochester, New York, and it was called Kodak. And they would really be pioneers in taking pictures instantly. A photo of the famous American writer Edgar Allan Poe. Most of you know Poe, the writer of the Macabre. Really interesting. Last week, studying in 7th grade, we were doing, the kids were doing Telltale Heart, which was kind of interesting. They were doing pictures and stuff of that was one of Poe's famous, but from very early on, it's like, we're getting pictures of a remarkable quality and resolution, and in a relatively quick period of time. So we have the daguerreotype. But usually with industrial commerce and inventions, there's usually, apples and oranges going on, and somebody else is trying to come up with a better mousetrap. And that guy was a guy by the name of Henry Fox Talbot, and he came up with another process called the calotype. 1839, the calotype. How is the calotype different from the daguerreotype? There's a lot of if you're one of these geeky whiz kids that wants to know all the technical information on the specific distinctions between the calotype and the daguerreotype, just go and read about it. You can read about it for the rest of your life while you're cooped up in your corona-free plastic bubble. You can spend years and years studying about the distinction between the calotype and the daguerreotype. However, Bongiorno will just speed it up for you and say that it was a paper-based process that was based on a negative, all right, and it was actually faster. It was actually a faster process than the daguerreotype, but what it gained in speed, and you could actually here was the first and it would become like the winner in the long run. Because what we would have in chemical photography after this would be different variations on the calotype. But you would be able to strike a print by using contact paper on this. What you lose with the calotype, and you probably don't notice from these specific pictures, is that you would lose some resolution. All right, so that would be the trade-off. The daguerreotype, much more distinct. The calotype, some loss in resolution. Can't remember. I believe this is a calotype, although they do still have this like this great beauty once it gets off the ground. The Open Door from 1843. We're talking a couple hundred years ago. I mean, how much time are we talking? 160 years ago. That's a long time. This is you can see though, it's like the beauty of it. Just the open door. The tangibility of the rocks in front, it's all very, very tangible. It's like the distinctions between the blacks and the whites in this, the exposure levels in front, the fact that there's as much, the contrasty nature of this, the way you can see the shadows on the bolts. It's very, very beautiful, and it's very advanced for 1843. This is just, and this will be in the PowerPoints, this was like a cartoon done around that time, drawing attention to like family photos. You had to stand very still in order to get an image, because if you moved around, you get blurry, and obviously it's like, the kids back then, I mean, let's just take it, let's just say it for what it is. The kids today, it's like those kids must have been these paragons of discipline. Because the kids today, to stand for the ADHD, like over sugar, eating tricks all morning long and playing Fortnite, in order to sit still for these photos, they would have to be chained up. There's no way. There's just no way it would happen. But even then, they're saying this is making a joke about interesting group posts for a daguerreotype, interesting and valuable result. That you needed, but they would literally, a lot of photographers literally would have portraitures where they would like kind of not manacle you in, but have like probably graphs for you to hold, all right? And it's very interesting. We had been talking in one class about why in most of the photos you see from these periods up through like the turn of the century and even further on, my grandparents, pictures of my grandparents, no one's smiling. Everyone's very somber. And we had a couple different theories that nobody ever really followed up on. But the fact of the matter is that in order to, it's like, if you had to stand there for like 20 minutes to take a picture, better to like have your facial muscles kind of relaxed. But then again, it's like, you know, they were somber people too. So that's like an independent research project for somebody. I don't think we ever adequately answered it. Picture of the Moon by John Whipple, 1852. Whipple was one of the Whipple was a pioneer, but 1852 we can already see these like, and this is like where I'm sure was taken in conjunction with a telescope, but we can see like various features on the moon, very very clear, very very advanced. And very beautiful. Another photography buff played around a little known fact about Lewis Carroll, the writer of Alice in Wonderland. He was a lot of different things. We know he was a Renaissance man. We know he knew a lot about physics and chemistry, and here's I believe it's a self-portrait that he took of himself, and also of Alice Hargraves. I'm sure he took it. The inspiration, the little girl that was the inspiration for Alice in Wonderland. So we've got that. Another very famous painting, another very famous photo, and I'm going to end with this, is this photo by Philip Henry Delamotte. It's called The Crystal Palace in London. Once again, you know, as a study in composition and a study of artistic framing. I mean, it really is a kind of masterpiece with these kind of convex curves and this sphere and the way that everything is like straight in the back. I mean, it's just this beautiful testament to architecture and garden and geometry, and it's just beautiful to look at, you know. So, I mean, photography, and I'll just kind of end with this. Photography would start as this, with most new media, it would kind of start as this novelty. Nobody knew where it was really going to go, and would end up becoming its own art form. And we will pick back up with that. Susan Sontag talks about that, specifically this transition from it being like a thing for like hobbyists and inventors and like geeks, and turning into a legitimate art form. And we will do that in the next lecture. So we'll see you then.